Welcome to this video on the psychological fantasy, using Pan's Labyrinth as a running example. I'm William Indick, author of Psychology for Screenwriters, now in its second edition. Written and directed by Guillermo del Toro in 2006, Pan's Labyrinth blends symbolic themes of fairy tale and a dark psychological fantasy that explores how children deal with psychological trauma. In the film, we meet Ophelia, a young girl on the verge of womanhood. Ophelia still lives in a world of childhood fantasies and fairy tales, while her mother reprimands her, telling her she's too old for fairy tales. She expects her daughter to grow up, take on the responsibilities of a young woman, and give up childish things. As Ophelia and her mother Carmen travel to meet her new stepfather in the mountains of Spain, her imagination draws her inwards into her own fairy tale about her own life. In this scene early on in the film, we see the process of imagination turning reality into fantasy. As a stick figure found inside an ancient stone carving, in the creative eyes of an imaginative child, becomes a fairy. Unconcerned with fairies and other childhood things, Carmen is more upset that Ophelia had ruined her shoes. Unlike her daughter, Carmen lives in the real world, not the fantasy world, and she must be concerned with what her new husband, Ophelia's new stepfather, will think of them. Carmen begs Ophelia to call her new stepfather father, even though she doesn't feel that he's a father towards her. She tells her, "It's just a word, Ophelia," not understanding that in the minds of children, words are magic. When they arrive at the outpost, Ophelia's imagination draws her immediately into an ancient pagan maze built during the time of the Romans, Pan's Labyrinth. The dark, twisting passages of the labyrinth will represent Ophelia's own journey through the dark, twisting passages of her own mind. Ophelia is afraid of her new stepfather, Captain Vidal. Her biggest fear is that Captain Vidal will take her beloved mother away from her. Ophelia doesn't understand the pressures of womanhood. All she knows is that she wants her mother. Captain Vidal represents the adult world and all of the fears that Ophelia associates with it. Captain Vidal is obsessed with his own legacy, and he doesn't care about Carmen or Ophelia. All he cares about is the child that Carmen is carrying, whom he believes to be his son. He even risks the life of Carmen and Ophelia by insisting they come to him for the baby to be born in this mountain villa. The kind doctor tells Captain Vidal that he shouldn't have brought Carmen in her condition. The doctor is the only one who outwardly stands up to Captain Vidal in any way. Captain Vidal is not only a tyrant, but a male chauvinist as well, which will, of course, be his downfall. Terrified of Captain Vidal and the adult world, Ophelia's imagination draws her deep into herself. The fairies that she imagines become ever more real, and they lead her down the dark staircases of the mystical labyrinth. As Ophelia descends into the labyrinth, she descends into the portals of her own unconscious fantasies. There she will uncover her deepest fears and most terrifying nightmares. At the bottom of the labyrinth, she meets Pan, a mythological figure. The Greek god Pan, often represented as a satyr, or half man, half goat, Pan hails from a belief system that preceded Christianity by thousands of years. The gods and goddesses and magical creatures of ancient mythologies were the wellspring upon which the fairy tales emerged. In modern fantasy, the name Pan is associated with Peter Pan, the magical boy who never wanted to grow up. Indeed, the childhood fantasy of defeating time by never growing up, never becoming an adult, and remaining an imaginative child forever is the key and central fantasy at the heart of all fairy tales and fantasy stories. Ophelia's own personal fantasy takes on the mystique of both a fairy tale and an ancient myth. In order to claim her true identity of Princess Moana, daughter of the moon and princess of the underworld, Ophelia must complete 3 tasks. Each of the 3 tasks symbolizes something about growing up, something about leaving behind childhood and becoming an adult, which is, of course, Ophelia's greatest fears. She is given the Book of the Crossroads, which is, of course, the crossroads of life, the crossroads between childhood and adulthood, which Ophelia is terrified to tread. In this story, Ophelia must choose her own future. Will it be a future of adulthood in the world of her mother and stepfather? Or will it be a future of childhood in which she goes backwards in time to retain her childhood innocence and charm? The Book of the Crossroads is empty at first, representing Ophelia's empty mind, the fact that she knows nothing about her future and what will become of her. A birthmark in the shape of a crescent moon is enough proof to young Ophelia that she is indeed Princess Moana. Carmen dresses up Ophelia in a pretty little apron and dress for a special dinner with Captain Vidal and his guests. Though Ophelia's dress is green rather than blue, it reminds the viewer of the dress that Alice in Wonderland wore as she descended into her own underworld of fantasy and illusion. Ophelia's first task is to encounter a magical, mystical toad who lives in a dying tree. The golden key she must retrieve is the key to her own fantasy, the key to her own quest for immortal childhood. In pursuing a task aimed at regressing deep down into her own childhood, Ophelia muddies her shoes and messes her dress, demonstrating to her mother at least that she is truly just a small child and not able to deal with the responsibilities of adulthood. Upon entering the ancient fig tree, all real things turn symbolic. The narrow entrance into the tree is a yonic symbol, symbolizing the vagina, or the uterus, the magical sphere of rebirth, where Ophelia will enter and be reborn. Inside the womb-like space of the ancient tree, Ophelia encounters the ancient toad. She tricks the toad into eating the stones, and the toad begins to vomit up a huge sack. Vomiting up the huge sack kills the toad, turning him inside out. This relates directly to Ophelia's fears about her mother, who is pregnant. When her mother gives birth, will it also turn her inside out? Will it also destroy her mother? Ophelia retrieves the key, though She's still unaware of what the key means and what secrets within her it will unlock. Returning home with her beautiful dress all muddied, Ophelia has taken a step backwards towards childhood, but a step forwards towards her goal of immortal childhood in her own personal fantasy. Meanwhile, the captain and his guests are sitting down for dinner, and we are afforded a bit of backstory about Captain Vidal's life. An officer recalls a story about Captain Vidal's legendary father, General Vidal, who, at the moment of his own death, smashed his watch on a rock so that his son, Captain Vidal, would not only know the exact hour and minute of his father's death, but he would also be reminded of the way in which a real man dies, fighting for his honor and for the honor of his country. Captain Vidal denies the story, even though the audience knows that it's true. The denial of a true story points to a truth that the character is too afraid to admit. Captain Vidal is secretly terrified that he can never live up to the high expectations of his martyred father. Ophelia is punished by her mother for her naughtiness by going to bed without supper. Ophelia goes back to the labyrinth to encounter the faun once again. Pan tells Ophelia that the rock carving depicts he and her, that it is his destiny to retrieve Ophelia from the mortal world and to bring her back as Princess Moana to the land of her destiny. This fantasy of a mystical birth in which her real parents are gods and goddesses and she is an immortal princess allows her to deny the truth of her life, in which Captain Vidal is her actual stepfather, her real father is dead, and her mother is in a very precarious position. The key retrieved from the belly of the toad takes on a more sinister symbolic tone. The key from inside the toad's belly may represent the baby inside her mother's belly, the baby that will be a rival for her mother's love, and the baby that Captain Vidal obviously cares more about than her mother or herself. Upon returning home, Ophelia opens the Book of the Crossroads to find the pages filling with blood. On a psychoanalytic level, blood represents the three fears of a girl becoming a woman. The blood that is shed when the mother gives birth to the baby, the blood that is shed at the loss of virginity, and the blood that is shed each month with a girl's period. All three representations of blood, the menstrual, sexual, and natal, are terrifying to Ophelia, as she seeks comfort and solace in the arms of Mercedes, a woman that reminds her of her mother. Ophelia asks Mercedes to sing her a lullaby, showing Mercedes and everyone else that she truly is still just a baby at heart, and all she wants is to be comforted by her loving mother, who is no longer available to her. As the story continues and Ophelia descends further into her personal world of fantasy, Pan becomes stronger and leaves the labyrinth to encounter Ophelia to tell her about her second task. He gives her a mandrake root. The mandrake is a plant that dreamt of being human, as we can tell by the human-like form of its root. The mandrake root is a clear symbol of the baby in Carmen's womb, Ophelia's brother. The root is to be placed underneath Ophelia's mother's bed in a bowl of fresh. By nourishing the root with milk and her own blood, Ophelia believes that she is taking over some of the responsibility of her mother and taking on some of the danger of giving birth to a baby. Pan tasks Ophelia with her second ordeal, to descend into the underworld and retrieve another magical object. Ophelia will encounter a feast, but she must overcome her childhood temptation to eat. She must eat absolutely nothing from the feast. As such, Ophelia's second task recalls the story of Persephone, who was forbidden by Hades to taste any fruit of the underworld, and also the story of Eve in the Garden of Eden, who was forbidden by God to taste from the fruit of the tree of knowledge. Overcoming the childish temptation to eat sweet fruits and yummies would demonstrate that Ophelia is no longer a child and ready to take on the trials of adulthood. Hence, she is setting herself up for a task that she cannot complete because she knows in her heart that she can never grow up. The time limit to complete her task represents the time limit that is set on all of our childhoods, and indeed on all of our lives. Once again, Ophelia descends into the deep, dark, unknown, unconscious passages of her own imagination. She enters the lair of the Pale Man. Pale Man is a slumbering monster sitting at the head of a table spread with a great feast. At first, he is blind and unconscious of Ophelia's presence. The terrifying paintings on the wall show Pale Man for who he truly is: adulthood, the destroyer of childhood, and the killer of innocence. Pale Man is the embodiment of Cronus, the father of the gods, who creates, destroys, and devours his own children. Cronus, the father time, devourer of all things. As a representation of death and the end of childhood, Pale Man indeed is Ophelia's greatest fear embodied. The pile of old children's shoes gives testament to Pale Man's ferocity and his never-ending hunger for the lives of children. Pale Man's seat at the head of a feast table indicates that he clearly is a representation of Captain Vidal. And the hourglass marking the time represents Cronus, the father of time and the killer of children, as well as Captain Vidal with his all-important wristwatch. And it also represents the sands of time that are drifting away for Ophelia, who is growing up and will one day, against her own will, become a woman. The hourglass symbol represents the same thing in The Wizard of Oz. It represents death, as in the end of childhood, which, for a childhood, is the same thing as death. Ophelia completes her task by using the key to retrieve a magical knife from the stone chamber. But then Ophelia demonstrates that she's still truly a child by disobeying both Pan and the fairies by eating a grape from the table. Eating the forbidden fruit immediately awakens Pale Man. Pale Man can now see Ophelia, both for the child she is and the woman she is terrified of becoming. Pale Man eats the fairies, devouring them hungrily, just as the sands of the hourglass continue to fall. Ophelia escapes, but just barely, clambering back to the mortal world, even as the real danger from the real villain in the mortal world becomes ever more dangerous. Captain Vidal's watch shows us that he truly is in league with Pale Man. The true danger of the villain is not his hatred for others, but his hatred for himself that he projects onto others. As Ophelia continues to feed and nourish the mandrake root, her mother continues to feel well. The mandrake represents the magic that Ophelia truly believes in as a child, and which she hopes will heal her mother. In stark contrast, Captain Vidal puts his faith in medicine, not magic, and in doing so, gives up on the life of Carmen, focusing only on what's important to him, his legacy and his son. Overhearing Captain Vidal, Ophelia now knows that it's her responsibility to save her mother's life. She speaks to her unborn baby brother, begging him not to hurt Carmen when he is born, though we know she is truly begging Captain Vidal not to hurt her mother. While entreating her unborn brother, she makes a fateful promise to him. Thanks to both the doctor's medicine and Ophelia's magic, Carmen is in recovery. She feels better, and for the moment, Ophelia feels better as well. And Ophelia is happy that her magic seems to be saving her mother's life. Pan returns, telling Ophelia that she failed her test by eating from Pale Man's table, and that she can never return. She will no longer be a child. She will grow old, and she will age, and she will die, just like every other mortal. She will be lost to time. The child Ophelia will vanish, and the Princess Moana will vanish as well. Not so much as punishment for eating the grape, but as the consequence for taking on the adult role of nurturer and carer for her mother. However, when Captain Vidal finds the mandrake root under Carmen's bed, he destroys it, and in doing so, he destroys Ophelia's role as her mother's caretaker. Once again, she is reminded by the adult world that she is getting old, that she must give up fairy tales and magic and take on the logic and reason of the adult world. The world indeed is a cruel place for children as well as for adults. Maybe the cruelest thing about the adult world is that magic truly does not exist. Not for Ophelia, not for Princess Moana, not for anyone. Nevertheless, in this story, magic does seem to play some importance, because as the mandrake is tossed onto the fire, it squeals like a baby. And at the same moment, something terribly wrong is going on inside of Carmen's womb. Ophelia's brother is born, taking his mother's life in the process. Pan tells Ophelia to fetch her brother and bring him to the labyrinth. To achieve this final task, Ophelia must rely on more than just magic. Using the good doctor's medicine, Ophelia drugs Captain Vidal. She steals her brother from Captain Vidal's stronghold in the clock tower and dashes to the labyrinth, with a leery and angry Captain Vidal right on her trail. As we enter the labyrinth for the last time, the full moon tells us that Princess Moana's story is about to come to fruition. The portal to the immortal world of fairy will only be open to Ophelia for a short time. To open the door, the blood of an innocent must be shed. To achieve her destiny of becoming the immortal Princess Moana, Ophelia must sacrifice her brother. In her final task, Ophelia demonstrates that she's something much greater than an immortal princess. She is, in truth, an innocent child who loves her brother. When Captain Vidal intrudes upon the situation, looking upon it with his adult eyes, he sees the reality that Ophelia is living in a fantasy world and that he must introduce her to the harsh reality of his own life. In killing Ophelia, he kills the child and takes possession of his son, but his victory is fleeting. His name will be forgotten, while Ophelia, shedding the blood of the innocent, will be reborn as Princess Moana, the immortal daughter of the sun and the moon, adorned with her own ruby red slippers, and reunited with her loving father, her adoring mother, and taking her rightful place in the fairy tale of her own story. While Ophelia does die, Princess Moana lives on, and our hero's quest of never growing old comes to fruition. Thank you for listening. And don't forget to check out my book, Psychology for Screenwriters, now in its second edition, as well as my other books on psychology and film, and my book on the psychology of fantasy, or my more recent books on media psychology. I hope you enjoy these episodes on the application of the science of psychology to the art of screenwriting.